in the end, watchmaking is irrelevant to selling watches. And that's what Rolex started out doing, that's what they've focused on doing, and that's what they're really good at doing. And the reason that I'm writing books about them, the reason that you're here, is that Rolex is damn bloody good at selling watches. I think we need to clear some misconceptions first. Rolex don't make the best watches in the world. Rolex didn't invent the waterproof wristwatch. Rolex didn't invent the automatic wristwatch. And a Rolex wasn't the first watch on the top of Everest. Those are facts. But Rolex is the most recognized brand in the world. It's undoubtedly the most profitable. But more importantly, it's the most interesting watch brand in the world. It's interesting because name me some other watch brands. Come on, name me a watch brand.
Patek.
Okay.
IWC.
Okay.
Cartier.
Cartier, yeah.
Omega.
Sorry, Cartier's
Yeah.
brand.
Yeah.
They just happen to sell watches.
Right. Okay. All of those names that you've just given me, Patek, Panerai, Roger Smith, do you know what joins them together? They're watchmakers. They were people who made one watch and then made a couple and then made a lot and then made a factory and went out. Rolex is the only major company that wasn't founded by a watchmaker. Hans Wilsdorf, until the day he died, when he signed any legal document, he didn't put watchmaker, he didn't put chairman of a company, he wrote merchant. And that's what he always was. He was a guy who bought stuff at one price and sold it at another. He was a salesman. And that makes a huge difference because you look at things differently. Watchmakers will always do what watchmakers do. You know, they'll look at the movement. How can I make this movement better? How can I make it more accurate? What can I do to make the balance beat more regularly? Wilsdorf didn't look at that. Wilsdorf looked at, how can I sell more watches? How can I define myself from everybody else who's selling watches? Wilsdorf, there's a famous line from Napoleon where he says, what kind of generals do you like? And he said, I like lucky generals. And I think that's one of the things you have to understand about Wilsdorf is that he knew when luck smiled on him and he made the best of it. One of the luckiest things he did, which may seem like the stupidest thing to have done, was that he founded Rolex not in Geneva or Le Chaux-de-Fonds or even Schaffhausen. He founded it in London. And he founded it in London in 1905. And that was, at that very moment, the best place in the world to fund a watch company. Because it was the heart of the empire. And the British Empire was at its absolute peak from the beginning of the 20th century until the beginning of World War I. He set up a company that essentially brought in very generic stuff. There was nothing particularly special about his watches. But he realized that the way to succeed was to differentiate yourself from everybody else. When he started selling wristwatches and realized that the wristwatch was a possibility, he needed a way to differentiate himself from other people. And what he did was he sought out a way to make his watches more reliable than anybody else's, not by improving the mechanism, not by doing the, keeping an eye on the balance rate, not by improving lubrication, any of the watchmaker things. He decided that the way to make a wristwatch better was to make it dustproof. And it's important to understand that he worked on making his watches dustproof, not waterproof. There was no point in making a watch waterproof because in 1910, 1915, 1920, nobody ever took a watch near water. So there's no point in making a watch waterproof. I mean, it's like nobody nowadays makes waterproof televisions because nobody takes a television into water. Similarly, then nobody ever took a watch into water, so it wasn't a problem. But dust was a problem. Back then, the lubricants that we used were mostly animal-based. If you were cheap, the lubricants came from boiled down horses' hooves. If you had an expensive watch, the lubricants came from the fat that's found in the head of a dolphin that was boiled down. That made the finest of all lubricants. The problem with these lubricants is that that if dust collected with them, the oils sucked the fibers of what dust is made from human skin, little bits of fabric, and back then the soot from coal fires. That was what it was made from. All of that is organic, and it loves oil. It loves to suck up moisture and lubricants. So if you got dust inside your watch, what happened was that this stuff turned it from being a liquid lubricant into a grease. And as more dust settled on it, it became harder and harder. That also stopped the watch. It didn't stop the watch, it slowed down. It made it much more difficult for the parts to turn. But crucially, as more of this stuff got congealed into the grease, it stopped being a lubricant and started being an abrasive and started to wear away the pivots and to wear away the bearings into which it was set. So he wanted to make a watch that was impervious to dust. And what's really interesting is that at the same time he was doing that, there was a man in England who had exactly the same idea, and that was John Harwood. Harwood didn't invent an automatic wristwatch because he thought winding wristwatches is so energetic that people might not be able to go to sleep at night after putting all that energy in. He invented the automatic wristwatch to get rid of the winding crown, because that hole where the winding crown goes in was the principal place that dust entered a watch. Getting rid of dust was the key. And when finally Wilsdorf, as a marketer, saw that somebody had come up with the idea of screw back and front cases, and somebody else had come up with the idea of screw down crowns. And he was approached by a case maker in Geneva who brought the stuff to him. The guy had already been making cases for him. Wilsdorf instinctively saw that was the answer to his problem. And that was the birth of the Oyster. And yes, Mercedes liked to swam the channel with one round her neck. And that watch just sold for 1 million Swiss francs the other day. But if you look at the advert that was in the Daily Mail a week later, where he promoted that, he doesn't say that, he says Rolex Oyster, the watch that defies the elements. But the first thing he talks about isn't water, it's dust. Because people realized that if a watch could resist water, it would resist dust. So the Oyster was the thing that changed everything for him. Because this was his unique selling point, the USP, something that all advertising agencies tell you you have to have. You have to have something that defines you from your competitor. And because he now had a USP, he could do something that he'd wanted to do all the time, which was to have his name, or the name of his company, on the face of every watch. And we think, of course it's on the face. But to be honest, they weren't. When, for the first few years that Rolex made watches, just like everybody who made watches, there was no name on the dial. If there was any name on the dial of a watch, it would be the name of the retailer. Because people didn't know brands. There weren't national advertising campaigns. You went to your local jeweler and you said, I want a good watch, I've got 5 guineas to spend. And they would show you a couple of watches. And you would never know who made it because you would have no relationship with the manufacturer. You would buy it from that jeweler. When it needed servicing, you take it back to that jeweler. And that's how it went. And it would be their name on the dial. But once Rolex had the Oyster, they were able to put their name on the dial. And do you want to pass this one around? This is from 1915. It's 110 years old, and my wife wears it quite regularly. What you have to understand is that simultaneous with him getting the name on the dial and getting the Oyster was that there was that newspapers, that railway systems had stretched throughout the UK, and it was possible now for everybody in the country to read the same newspaper at the same time every morning. And that meant that you could now have national advertising campaigns, which had never been possible before. And if you have a brand that you want to sell, rather than saying go to your local jeweler and buy a watch, if you have a brand, you need to have an advertising campaign. And Wilsdorf was one of the first watch brands ever to launch their own advertising campaign. And they did this with a company called St. Garland, who were one of the first of the English advertising agencies. And we look at everything that Wilsdorf did from that moment on. It was all about marketing. It wasn't about, the watch keeps phenomenal time. It wasn't about the watch can do this or can do that. It was about getting the name out and getting it in front of people. The one thing that he did focus on that also I think differentiated him from all the other brands was that he wanted to have his watches independently checked for timekeeping. So he was the first person, his company was the first company to go to the Geneva observatories and get a chronometer certificate for a wristwatch. And that was done as early as that watch there, 1915. And from then on, if you look at these early Rolex watches, you'll see inside the back, it will say 15 world records, 25 world records, 30 world records. These were watches that were submitted to the observatory. If they passed beyond a certain number of points, they were awarded the title of especially good. And Rolex focused on this. Again, it was a way of differentiating himself from the other brands. He focused on what the watch could do, not on essentially. I break it down into there's the Wilsdorf period and the post-Wilsdorf period. That's when, and Rolex changed dramatically in those two periods. Wilsdorf died in 60, but he was moving away from the company from about 58 because he was very ill with rheumatic arthritis. It was very difficult for him to even to walk. While he was in charge, it was all about the 31 world records. It was about what were called testimonies. Other people would call them brand ambassadors. But the difference was that he had people like Donald Campbell, the race car driver, various aviators who flew long distance flights, who all wrote about how they loved their Rolex watch. It performed wonderfully at 30,000 feet and so on and so forth. But one of the interesting things was at the bottom of all these ads he would write, Sir Donald has not received any remuneration for this. He wanted to make it clear that these were people who were doing this because they loved the product, although they may have been given a free product. That was Wilsdorf. When he passed on, two things happened. They hired, again, an advertising agency in London, a different one, but the English branch of a giant American advertising agency, J. Walter Thompson, who at that time were the biggest agency in the world. And a guy crept in from the side called Mark McCormack, who was an agent for golf players at that time. He had 2 or 3 golfers as his clients. And he linked up with Rolex. And what came from that was the campaign that ran through the 60s and 70s, which was that men who guide the destinies of the world wear Rolex. Rolex shifted from being performative to being aspirational. And that's still the path they take now. If you look at the current campaign, it's reach for the crown. What they're not talking, yes, you got loads of adverts back then. If you were flying the Concorde tomorrow, you'd be wearing this and showing a GMT master. If you were diving off the reef of Puerto Rico tomorrow, you'd be wearing this, and they'd show a picture of the Submariner. But it was, again, the things they showed, Concorde, diving, famous golfers and famous mountaineers and what have you. These were all aspirational things. These were things that middle-class guys would have loved to be able to do or would love to be able to afford to do. And again, it's all marketing. And what's really interesting to me is if we look at the history of the people who have run Rolex, Wilsdorf, Mr. Heinegger Sr., Mr. Heinegger Jr. Then we had Bruno Mayer, then we had Moretti, and now we have Jean-Frédéric Dufour. Apart from Bruno Mayer, who was only there for 3 years, all of these people came from the sales and marketing division of Rolex, not from watchmaking. And Bruno Mayer came from banking. Rolex has never been run by a watchmaker. Rolex has never, bizarrely, even though they developed the Sky Dweller, they developed the Deep Sea Challenge, they developed the new Dynapulse Escapement, they developed all sorts of stuff. In the end, watchmaking is irrelevant to selling watches. And that's what Rolex started out doing, that's what they've focused on doing, and that's what they're really good at doing. And the reason that I'm writing books about them, the reason that you're here, is that Rolex is damn bloody good at selling watches.